Today, we are talking about procurement of tools. So, we're coming to you via Zoom today. A few years ago, this would have been in a conference room. So how do you procure tools for oftentimes your staff and make sure that everybody can use them? The other aspect of what we're looking at today is outsourcing. So we at Hassel Inclusion did not make and code and design all of our website ourselves. I've been working in the industry long enough to know that we're all experts at what we do, and we bring in experts at what they do, designers, coders, all sorts of people to do that. That's a normal thing for everybody. The question is, how, as an organization, do you make sure that they live up to the accessibility that you want to get from them? So we're going to be looking at those two aspects of accessibility today, and fundamentally how all of your digital technologies as an organization can be made accessible. But what I wanted to do is to situate it where you are. So, because sometimes you kind of think, is this really important? Shouldn't we just be doing sort of more like testing and WCAG? Well, so I've got a Slido that I'd love you to join in. If you go to slido.com, it will look something like this. And here in the box here to enter a code, you enter 30071. That just happens to be the number of the international standard that we've created. So it hopefully puts it in your mind. But in there are two sets of questions. The first set about which of the tools that we use do you use in your regular work? And then the second thing is whether or not you're creating your website, your mobile apps, those sorts of things yourselves in the organization that you work in, or whether or not that's actually something that is done by externals for you. And so, yeah, 3 people have already sort of come through, and I can kind of show the poll sort of building up on the screen here. So it just gives us a good idea of the sorts of things that are really important for people, maybe the things that are quite less important for people. But it's great to see that even things like our scorecard are being used by a lot of people at the moment. So a lot of things coming through on that poll. Similarly, I mean, 62% of the people who've put their information into here already have outsourced to an agency the creation of their external site. So that's what we figured. That's why we're doing this today, because that means that it's really, really important, not just that you know accessibility, but the people who are going to be creating the site for you know accessibility too, and that the relationship that you have is working well. A lot of people putting information into there, everyone using sort of things like Zoom, but things like kind of Google Mail, all of those sorts of things. This is what we do every day of the week, especially when it comes to working from home. And so it's really important to make sure that everybody in an organization is able to use the tools the organization provides. So there's enough there to make us feel like what we're going to be talking about today is really useful for all of you. So thank you for participating in that. The other thing to say there is there's a little hint there at the bottom. It wasn't us plugging our scorecard mercilessly at the bottom there. It was actually a little hint that actually our scorecard isn't perfectly accessible. And actually, that's one of the challenges about this whole thing. There are only 2 organizations in the world who can have the technology to do those sorts of scorecards. The first one was, and the one that we've used, was the only one in existence when we started the project. And they weren't perfectly accessible, but they were the only way that we could get stuff done. So we've worked with them to improve their accessibility. But sometimes, actually, you can't get to a point where it's absolutely perfect. Sometimes you have to make hard decisions and use accessibility statements and all of that. So this is a really safe place. If you don't feel like your accessibility is perfect yet, you are amongst friends, because we have exactly the same challenges on occasions, especially when we work with organizations that we need to work with that have great technology. It just doesn't quite come up to the level that we'd like to get to. And so it just gives you an idea of the reality today. As I say, any questions that you have, pop them into the chat, and we've got time at the end to answer them. So procurement, outsourcing, Why are these things important, and why can they be difficult to achieve? Well, just in case if you like, the figures around disability aren't there in your mind, it's worth just kind of starting off. The reason that we do this is because, for example, 19% of working age adults have a disability. So if the tools that are being created and procured for staff aren't accessible, that's potentially up to 19% of the staff of an organization who actually can't use them. 44% of pension age adults have a disability. So when it comes to the websites that you're creating, it could be that all of your audience out there, needs accessibility, and it's not just people with a disability, it's older people as well. And another thing just to kind of add into that, especially as some of the things are actually touching on staff facing, is that there is a big emphasis in the recruitment market at the moment around neurodiversity. The way people think in different ways, if they're dyslexic or autistic or any of these sorts of conditions, can actually be a real bonus for an organization. Diversity can have a lot of challenges, but also a lot of benefits. And actually the challenges can be solved by accessibility. So you get all of the benefits of a really diverse workforce. So these are some of the reasons why this is really important, what we are talking about today. So we're going to look at this, as I say, from these two perspectives. So the perspective of procuring a digital tool that's already been created. So something like Zoom or Monday.com is what we use for our project management, resource management. We use numerous tools like you all do every day. We try and make sure as an employer at Hassel Inclusion that those tools are as accessible as possible so that we can hire people with all sorts of different types of disabilities. And so how do we do that? How do we deal with the challenges around that? The other aspect of it is that outsourcing. So we've already seen over 60% of the people on the call outsource their website to an agency or somebody else to create. So how do you make sure that that really works? And the good news is that your suppliers really should care. Accessibility is a requirement increasingly to sell services and tools into many markets. So, for example, there are people on the call from governments in the UK, I think government in other countries as well. And actually a lot of countries have effectively said for public procurement, if you've got a tool that you want to sell into government, accessibility will be asked for. This, if you like, is that barrier for entry. If there is a more accessible tool out there and a less accessible tool, it is more likely that the more accessible tool will be the one that is selected. And as I say, that's where thankfully things are at the moment, but it can still really kind of fall down. We've been working in this area for a long time, and so those two sides, your organization who wants a tool or wants to outsource the creation of a website, and then the agency or vendor who are going to do it. Unfortunately, sometimes the communications don't work. And I'm going to show this from both sides. So there are people on the call who could be on the other side, if you like, actually creating a product that they want people to buy. And so, but I wanted to tell you a couple of stories. So first story, this is an actual quote from a few years ago. We did what we call a lunch and learn for an organization to enable more people in that organization to understand that accessibility was really important. And as part of that, I did like a 30-minute quick test of this organization's website. And in the session, I presented not only the business case behind accessibility, but also just a really quick idea of where they were currently at. And they were great in some areas and really not great in others. And when I said that, somebody at the back of the room said, "That can't be the case." And I thought, okay, this is interesting. And I said, well, why do you say that? And they said, well, we didn't create our site. And I said, you probably missed it in your contract. And he said, no, we didn't. It's there in the contract. WCAG 2.0 AA is the requirement for deliverables. And I said, well, I'm really sorry, but unfortunately, I've just tested your site and there's all sorts of problems on it. So how long, has that contract been in existence for? 3 years. So basically, my client had been asking and paying for an external agency to deliver accessibility as part of the quality of the code, only to find that actually they hadn't been doing it at all. And that was the start of a very interesting journey there. So sometimes those who are depending on their suppliers can be let down. The other side, though, the other story is those who are being outsourced from. So digital agencies, back in when I was leaving the BBC around sort of 10, 11 years ago, I was invited to go and speak for World Usability Day on the British standard that we'd just been creating. And we had an agency saying, we are really good at accessibility, but nobody ever asks us. We're good at it, but we keep losing work to companies that don't even know what it is. Because from their perspective, if they put in a little bit more money into their bid to an organization to create a website for them, that money to help them test the website, for example, for accessibility, that could make them more expensive than the company down the road who didn't care two hoots about this. And so organizations were losing money. This is the problem that we're trying to get rid of. We need everybody to understand how to actually handle these relationships to get things going well for accessibility. So when we popped this out on Eventbrite, we had a load of questions come through, everything from how do you educate suppliers that don't understand this? Is Zoom accessible and usable? Things around VPATs, voluntary product accessibility templates, we're going to be touching on that. Questions around, okay, if you've got the government vendor network, is everybody in there fine? Have they all been vetted for accessibility? I think there are people on this call who will know the answer to that better than I do, because we don't work in government. But actually that question about should I take people's word for it is a really key thing. And then, especially because there's a lot of organizations who have to, if you like, go for the cheapest bid when it comes to procurement. So sometimes they're working with different companies. They don't really able to kind of build up working relationships. How do you handle that, even for kind of small procurements? And then the other aspect of this, which is how do we check, what do we do when things go wrong? How do we hold people to account if they don't deliver? What's the timetables for fixes to be made? I'm guessing that was from somebody who was up against things in terms of deadlines. That's the sort of stuff that we're talking about today. And this was another kind of point from someone, always interested in seeing a productive working relationship. That's what we're about. It's about how to get a great relationship between, if you like, the client and the vendor, so that they both know what it is that they're trying to achieve and that they're really clear about how they're going to get there. And I wanted to give you another story on this. So I started out my accessibility journey at the BBC. I was there for 10 years, and the first 3 years I was the head of standards and guidelines there. And one day, I got a phone call from the HR department to say the new jobs portal was going live the next day. And could I come and have a look at it before it went live for standards purposes? And at the BBC, the way that we, if you like, policed standards was to involve people in the creation of those standards. All of the different parts of the BBC were on our working group. So literally, we created the standards that we all had to abide by. Nobody had ever thought that HR needed to be on any of those working groups because they didn't do digital, they did HR. Well, actually, because they didn't do digital, they didn't make their website and they outsourced it. And on this particular occasion, this website didn't comply with any of our standards at all. And they were launching live the next day. And when we did a quick test on it for accessibility and sent through to say, okay, these are all of the things that need to be fixed, the 2 stages removed supplier, so BBC had commissioned it from one supplier and they'd outsourced it to another one. They said, yeah, we can fix all of those. It will cost you £150,000. And you can probably have it by the end of the year. What do you do about that? In general, finding it at the end of the process is not the time to do that. It shouldn't cost you £150,000 and it shouldn't delay the whole project by that amount of time. If we compare that to something else that I did at the BBC, I learned from that. A couple of years later, I was the accessibility manager of BBC Jam, £150 million worth of education websites where kids learnt via playing games. Possibly the hardest thing in the world to make accessible is games. And we had 25 different suppliers externally and 25 different production teams internally at the BBC. But we sorted it all on day one, because we said exactly what it was that people needed to do. And most of them had no idea. So we gave them training in all of that. It was my job to recruit a team to support them all to be able to deliver that. That's the sort of thing that you can do. So a couple of just really kind of simple things before we kind of dive into a lot of the content. The key thing when you're looking at these sorts of things is contracts. Does it say in the contract that accessibility is a requirement? If it doesn't, it's really, really hard to change that. If it does, then you have a lot more power. So the first thing is, if you don't ask for accessibility, it won't be delivered to you. The second thing, going back to that company that put it in the contract but didn't realize they weren't getting it, was if you can't test the quality of what you're getting, you don't know if you got it. So it's really important to do things like check the competence of the supplier. You know, they say they're going to do accessibility. Can they really deliver it? And then checking to see if you actually got what you paid for. 3 months after that particular lunch and learn, we were actually training all of the people in that particular organization, or at least 10 of them, how to do audits themselves of things as things came in, to just check that the supplier was living up to their end of the bargain. So I'm going to go through these kind of various things in different ways. As I say, I can see questions coming through. That's good. Keep on coming. There will be time at the end to answer them. And I've got some of my colleagues on the line as well, who can possibly answer some of them, even in the text before we get there. The first thing, can I trust what they claim they've already done? So we're looking at what people's claims are about what they've done. If you like it, that's certainly if you're in the UK, Blue Peter, a really famous British TV show. Here's one I made earlier. You know, I've done this before, you can rely on me. Well, can you? How do you know? And what questions can you ask to separate those who really know what they're doing from those who don't? So we're going to look at these, as I say, from these two angles. And the first angle is, so if people have made a tool already and you're procuring that tool, then how do you know that it's good? Well, the first thing is to look for information on the level of accessibility. And this is that VPATs we were talking about, voluntary product accessibility templates. I'm sure there are people on the call who have looked at these, but you probably don't quite know oftentimes, unless you're a real expert in accessibility, how to read these, what these actually mean. So just a little few moments on that, because the key thing here is that the V in VPAT is voluntary. So actually it's an organization that they don't have to create one of these, but actually they do these days for most people to buy their product. But what it doesn't say is that who creates this thing. So it's really important for you to know whether or not you can rely on the information in the VPAT. And the best question that we think that you should ask is this one. Can you take me through it and explain what it means? Now, because you see, from that simple question, and all of the questions are going to be this simple and quite disarming in some ways, and certainly disarming for any organizations who actually know what they're doing when it comes to accessibility. If the organization knows what they're doing and you're asking them, take me through the VPAT, they will probably light up and not stop talking for the next kind of hour, telling you about all of the things in it. However, if they don't really have a clue, then they won't really know what to do. And you've kind of got your answer there already. It's entirely possible that somebody else created a VPAT for them so that they would need, if you like, to bring that external supplier in to kind of help them with the answer. But unless they can get these things readily for you, I wouldn't trust that company. If, however, you have to do this yourself, how do you, as maybe some people who are really expert in accessibility, but most who aren't, how do you actually use these things well? Well, there's effectively a couple of different parts to a VPAT. The top part is the detail part. So what they do, all of the web content accessibility guidelines, each one of them, they need to put in there whether the product supports it, partially supports it, or doesn't support it. So if it supports it, that's a tick, if you like. And this is the equivalent of all of the stuff that comes back from an accessibility audit. It's very, very detailed. And if you're not an accessibility egghead, if you like, you probably need a course to understand that. Lower down in the document, however, there is something which is a lot easier to understand. So further on down in this part at the bottom here, they actually say, let's look at this from a human's perspective. So they say, okay, I want you to gather together all of the things that are wrong with this product and say which ones of those actually impact on someone who doesn't have vision, or maybe doesn't have hearing, or maybe has difficulty using a mouse or something like that. And from that, you're able to look at that and say, okay, if we're just about to procure this tool and we know that we've got somebody in the organization who's blind, this is the list of problems. These are the things that are going to cause problems for that particular person in our team. And it is possible that actually you have people with some types of disabilities in your organization and not others. So you're able to look at this and say, of all of the things that aren't great about this tool yet, is that going to impact the real human beings in our organization? Now, obviously, you want everything to be fine so that you can recruit anybody who has the right talents for your organization. But it's that kind of, if you like, pragmatic view that might help you through. And you can use that to have a look at that. The other thing is that partially supports thing or not supports. It's not necessarily game over. If the product itself doesn't support everything, can you do a workaround? So for example, if it's a room booking system, then if people can't use it, is there another mechanism that they could use? These are the sorts of things that's useful to look at. So learn how to read these things, because the other thing is they can be really old and really out of date. So detailed questions to ask if you've got the people in front of you. Did you do the VPAT yourselves, or did you get it done by somebody who's independent? So who's actually kind of saying that the product is good? Is it the company themselves that may kind of make things kind of seem better than they are and may not actually really know how to audit for accessibility anyway? Or was it an independent expert who did that for them? Is it the latest version? So for example, this is Zoom's VPAT. I downloaded it from their website a couple of days ago. So Zoom, as I'm pretty sure that we all know, has been going through pretty much about one update per week in the last year. So the amount of new sort of features and all of these sorts of things. And yet the VPAT is dated 2020, September 2020. So this VPAT now is at least half a year old. So this says what the product was like in September 2020, not now. And it's better than nothing. But actually, the question you would want to ask then is, okay, well, how is it now? Because I'm not buying your product from ages ago. I'm buying what you've currently got. Is it the right version for your country? We've got people on the call from all different countries. There are different versions of the VPAT. One which is for America, which is where VPAT started, one for Europe. There's an international version. That's the one I think that is the best. So again, just check it's right for your country. And then the fundamentals is if it says, like all of these do, that it isn't perfect yet, what are they going to do about it? Are they actually going to just go, well, there we are, we've told you our product is bad, it's up to you now, or actually are they going to improve anything? The other thing is we found a number of the organizations that we work with just don't trust VPATs at all. And they want to test things, especially with representatives from their employee resource group of people with disabilities, to say, okay, give us a test version of your product and we'll see if it really works for our staff. It's a great way of doing things as well. Say, for example, we're on the other side of things. So if you're actually outsourcing the creation of a website, something like that, people will say things like this: we will deliver you a WCAG 2.0 AA compliant website. That's about the best you normally get from these conversations. But what you really want is something like, give me an example of where and how your team have done this for another client. So you say you can do this. Okay, prove it, show me. Would you be happy for us to get in touch with somebody whose website you created? If you've had audits done and things like that, then obviously you're not going to give us the full audit of the website because you've done that for another company. But prove that you can test things and deliver things. That sort of thing. Give us proof. Give us an example is a really great way of making sure that the people you're about to, if you like, give your website's creation to, that you can rely on them. Okay, so that's the first part. Second part, so that was, can you trust what they said about what they do? How about can you trust what they claim that they will do now? So, and fundamentally, let's hope that you don't have a joker on the other side of the things, but it's all part of the plan, is exactly what you're looking at here. And again, can you rely on their plans? So if they've made the tool already, if it's Zoom or something like that, it's actually all about them fixing it. So the questions are, again, really, really simple. What's your roadmap to fix things? Show me your roadmap. How long will it take you to get this stuff fixed? You know, I may give you, say, 3 months to fix that, but actually, if it's not up to the level that I require at the moment, you're going to need to promise me that it's going to get me to the place where I want it to be before I buy your tool. But also, it's not just about that. It's about, will they actually deliver that? It's great to have a plan, but if they have no capability, no ability to actually kind of fix things, to actually get accessibility right, and a process to fix things, then there's a real problem. And if you like, by implication, if they've given you a VPAT that says all of the things that are wrong in their product, by implication, they've gotten it wrong until this point. So what is going to change? You know, your product isn't great. You're now saying that if we give you some money, you'll make it brilliant for accessibility in sort of 6 months. How can we trust you? You know, like, what is your process? How are you going to get this right when you haven't until now? You know, are you going to train people? All of these sorts of things. And this is one of the reasons why we created the international standard. So ISO 30071 Part 1, because that's the sort of thing that says, okay, this certifies not the product, but the capability of the teams that created it and the processes that they use. If they've got this, and nobody really has yet because it's still early days, but if they've got this, then you know that they'll be able to do that. And if they don't have a plan and they don't want to fix things, you know, what should you do? Well, if you haven't bought it yet, you can back out and you can say, actually, we just don't want to do that. But we've had numerous instances where organizations have phoned us like the night after they signed the contract and said, we've just suddenly thought accessibility. We never asked them about it. We don't know if it's accessible. Can you test it? And if you find problems, what do we do? And a lot of that comes down to that question from someone earlier about, how do we enable an organization who doesn't need to care, doesn't need to fix things because we didn't put it in the contract? How do we enable them to understand that this is a good thing for them to do so that you can get what you want? As I say, if you're in that situation where you have tools that aren't accessible and suppliers who don't want to make them accessible, we've dealt with a lot of this over our time. So please let us know, and I'm sure we can help. If they're going to make the product for you, then it's all about making sure that if that you can accept their claims. And again, it's the same thing, checking their process. So we will deliver you a WCAG 2.0 AA compliant website. That's not proof. That just says that's the thing that they know that you want them to say. And anybody can say that, even if they don't understand what it is. They can cut and paste that in from, 10 tips for getting people to buy your services. You need to get underneath that. So you need to say, okay, what proof do I have in your capability, in your process? So when was the last time that people in your team got trained in accessibility? What process are you using? Where is accessibility in your testing plan? I can't see it here. It says that you're going to do user testing at the end of it, but I can't see any people with disabilities in there. So, what proof can I see in your plan that you will be able to do this? And then the other thing, and this is the thing that we've always asked. So if there's one question that I encourage you to ask, it's this: what is the most challenging part of my product to make accessible, and how will you achieve this? Again, it's that sort of thing where if you ask that to the right sort of company, they will geek out on you and they will go, oh, well, you see, this bit here is going to be really, really difficult because it's a component and we're going to use this JavaScript library, but don't worry, we've worked out the accessibility, all of this sort of stuff. You ask that to everybody else and they will go, sorry, my answer, standard answer, which is WCAG 2.0 AA, is not an answer to this person's question. And they will look like a rabbit in the headlights. And they'll kind of go, can I get back to you on that? At that point, you probably know that, yeah, they can get back to you on it. And if they brought in their real expert who knows this, then maybe you should go with them. But you pretty much know that this isn't a core part of what they do. You wouldn't get that answer for security and privacy. So as I say, asking the right question can really help. I can see loads of questions coming through. That's good, but we'll get to them soon. 2 more sections and we're there. Can I trust them to keep it good when it is good? So that's the thing. So I've got a tool that's been made, for example, already, and they fixed it. It's now perfect. Their VPAT says supported all the way through it. It's absolutely smashing. So should you procure that product? Well, certainly in today's climate, I would be staggered that you see a VPAT like that, and probably I would advise you to get it checked out, because it's chances are they are slightly misleading you. Everything has problems in it. But the key thing is, even if it is perfect, that's not the point. How long will you be using this thing for? So, for example, is it a month-long contract? Certainly for a small company, if you want to move from Zoom to Teams to Google Meet or whatever, it's very easy to do, and and you're not locked in very much. But if you're a huge organization, deciding to use a particular product, you will probably have a lock-in period of 18 months, 2 years, something like that. So if they're going to continue making the product, is it going to continue being accessible, or actually is it going to fall off over time? So again, the question is that process question again. What processes will you use to keep the accessibility at a consistently good level over the course of this contract? So as I say, they're adding all of this new functionality all of the time. And so if you procure it, now, because it's good, will it be good in 3 months' time? We did some really interesting work with, shall we say, a regulator, and the organizations that they regulated all had mobile apps. And if you like, the core part of those mobile apps was good, but actually over time, some of the newer functions, the new chat functions, all of these sorts of things weren't accessible. And it's kind of like, okay, if people had signed up to those suppliers, then actually over time, it may have started off good, but they may have got less and less satisfied as somebody with a disability using and relying on that supplier, because they didn't keep things good. You could be hitting these organizations at the high watermark level of accessibility, where they've got somebody like who would appear on one of these webinars who's really great at accessibility. They may leave next month. What happens to that company then? Is it one person who's great at accessibility who could go at any moment, or does the company know how to do this? If you're signing up to something for 2 years, you want to know that stuff. And so again, it's all about the capability, the process, how all of this is created in there. It's the reason why that is a key thing for procurement people in conversations around the ISO standard. If they're going to be making the product for you, so if they're going to be creating a website or whatever it is for you, the other aspect of this is, so they're the experts, but you are the organization who's actually going to keep that website going after they've created it. So are they actually embedding in the product features that enable you to keep it accessible, because you will be doing it, not them? So we will deliver you a WCAG 2.0 AA compliant website. Doesn't really cut it, because day one, when they deliver it to you, it may be perfect. But then your content people start adding pages to it, and the accessibility gets worse and worse and worse if they haven't embedded accessibility in things like the content management system, or maybe putting some guidelines there so that people know how to keep content accessible. It also could be the case, and this is normally the case for content management systems, that the content management system versions will need to be updated over time. So we use WordPress for our website. I can't remember which version, 4.5 point whatever at the moment, but every now and again I get an email that says we've updated the underlying version of WordPress. Has that just broken the accessibility of our website? Is a really good question to ask. And actually, I'm not an expert in WordPress. That's the question I have to ask the people who actually created the website for us. So ask that question up front. How do we keep this good once we've got it good? And then the final section, and then we'll get to all of your questions. What happens if they can't deliver? So you signed up to the contract, and then suddenly they're keeping all these plates spinning: privacy, security, functionality, performance, accessibility. Oops, actually, we're doing badly on some of these, so we're going to let the accessibility plate fall. And we're going to hope that you don't mind, or that you don't even notice. How do you deal with that situation? So whether they've made it already or they're making it for you, it's all about thinking ahead. It's all about the communication. So again, this is the question. If you can't deliver accessibility in a release, because it may not necessarily be the first release, it may be half a year later, what will you do as our supplier to make that okay for us and our users? Is this our problem, or is it your problem? Because if it's our problem, then we're not particularly happy with that. This is the relationship you need to establish, and you need to establish this contractually. You need really clear terms in the contract and the plan that says, okay, when you deliver, this is the deadline, so we need you to deliver on these dates. What proof is needed? So you don't just say it's accessible, but actually you give us your audit, your clean bill of health. What are the penalties if you get it wrong? And you need to establish all of that contractually at the start of the process. And I was just reviewing one of these for one of our clients. In fact, it was exactly the same client who had that quote at the beginning. So originally they were just like WCAG 2.0 AA. Because of that particular scenario, their contract is now pretty draconian. I mean, it's gone beyond bulletproof to, if we audit your website and we find problems with it, you are in deep trouble. And that is their master services agreement with every single one of their digital agencies. If you, as a digital agency, want to work with that company and you can't sign up to that, you can't work with them. That's probably going a little far for most organizations, but that's really, really good. So clear communications. If problems occur, once you've got the contract in place, the other thing is that people tend to hide problems. So you need to make it clear to people, if you're having difficulty with accessibility, tell us whilst you're having the problems. Notice, don't wait until the end of the project to say, oh yeah, actually, we couldn't really deliver that bit. Sorry. That doesn't help you at all. They need to give you lots of notice, because you need to be able to deal with that with them. Workarounds. So it's not the end of the day, the whole story if they can't get everything perfect for you. But what you will need to do is to brainstorm workarounds. So things like accessibility statements. We've not been able to make all of these things accessible, and yet here is a way that if this impacts you as somebody with a disability, that you can actually get around this problem. That is what you need to do to enable people to have an okay experience. And then the time scale. So that question there from someone earlier, like how long have we got? It's up to you. If you've got a deadline that says that you've got to get something in on a particular date, then that's the time you've got. If you don't have a deadline, it's up to you as to, if you like, how long you're going to give people to get things up to date. So the 5 key questions to remember. So did you do the VPAT yourselves? Is it up to date? What's your roadmap to improve the tool's accessibility if you're procuring a digital tool? How are you going to keep it accessible? And what proof do I have that you're going to be able to do that? And if you can't deliver accessibility in release, what will you do to make that okay for us and our users? That's for digital tools. If it's creation of digital products, it's more like, give me an example of where and how your team have done this for other people. What proof do I have? Show me your process. What's the most challenging part of my product to make accessible? Are you up for the challenge, or are you scared of the challenge? Or do you not even know that there's a challenge there? And then, as I say, can I trust you in the future? If you are, are you building in mechanisms so that people who don't know anything about accessibility in our content authoring team will be able to keep this going? And again, the same question on what happens if you fail.